Welcome to the place where we gain knowledge through the lens of creativity. I am Aaron Dworkin, and this is Artful Science. Thanks again for joining me here on Artful Science. Today's show is The Benjamins, the Science of Wealth Inequality. And my guest is Bruce Boghosian, Professor of Mathematics at Tufts University. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Well, it's so great to have you here. And I always like to just dive right in, right? So this is obviously an issue that we hear about a lot, and the wealth inequality that exists, but we really want to get to the science, because a lot of times people say, well, should it matter? Does it really exist? These types of things. So we all know that a few people, especially in our country, have all of the money. But does science really permit us to know about the specifics of wealth inequality? In other words, how much richer are the rich really in our country?
Mathematicians and economists look at this by looking at distributions of wealth. There are ways to mathematicize the problem. And right now, the rich in our country are much, much, much richer than the rest of the population. And it's a growing gulf between them. One of the problems with this is it becomes very difficult for people who aren't sort of well-versed with quantitative arguments to picture just how much richer they are. Sometimes people think, well, the difference between a million, a billion, a trillion, they're all big numbers, they must be the same. They're not. They're a factor of 1,000 apart, each of them. We struggle to picture what a million things would look like. We begin to really flounder when we get to a billion, and I don't know that people are good at all at picturing what $100 billion looks like, or $200 billion. So there's a visualization problem associated with it. It's interesting that this connects with the arts a little bit, because visualizing quantitative information effectively is almost an art form. And there are some good ways of doing this that are available on the web. I would encourage everybody to take a look at a web page that's, it's called Wealth Shown to Scale. I think if you Google those words, you'll get to see it. It's by Matt Korostoff. And it essentially gives you one pixel to represent $1,000. And you get a little block of pixels to represent the median wealth that somebody might earn in a year, and you get a bigger block to represent $1 million. And this goes on until we get to the wealth of Jeff Bezos, and you continue to scroll for sort of an insanely long time as you see his wealth measured in pixels.
Right. And so is there any sense to are there any quick takeaways that we know about this wealth inequality of income, like what typically people in kind of this stratosphere are making versus the average American?
Well, most of our work is really on wealth inequality rather than income inequality, and it's important to distinguish the two.
So a great question on that. Could you kind of just extrapolate a little? In other words, as say not just an American, but an American of color, and I think about these things, I think a lot of times I might think, oh, well, it's just how much I'm earning. Why does my wealth matter? Why should I be looking at that?
Well, the income is sort of a rate. It's the amount of money or that you earn in 1 year. Wealth is all your accumulated assets minus any liabilities you have. So you add up properties, wealth, stocks, all of those things. You would subtract liabilities like mortgages that are outstanding, and that would give you your total wealth. Wealth inequality in essentially every country in the world is much greater than income inequality. Income inequality is bad. Wealth inequality tends to be far, far worse.
Gotcha. And do we know why? So in other words, I guess if I'm just thinking, well, if I make less money, let's say I make 70 cents on the dollar from this, average, more affluent person, but basically you're saying is I wouldn't necessarily have 70% of their wealth. Why do I end up being hurt more or end up with less wealth than I have less income already? Why do I get hurt again?
I see. Wealth, of course, tends to be accumulated over generations, especially at the very top. It has a very long lasting power. One of the things that we can look at with the kind of mathematical models we use is how persistent wealth is. If you start off wealthy at some time, what is the probability that you're going to be wealthy after a certain amount of time? How long does wealth persist? And this connects with how long does it take, to increase your wealth, but how much does your wealth remember what your wealth is now? This is called autocorrelation in mathematics. And at the very top, it turns out to be a very, very long time. Really, at the very top and the very bottom, it turns out to be a very long time. If you are poor, you're likely to be poor for a long time afterwards. If you're rich, you're likely to be rich for a long time afterwards. The middle class is more volatile. If you're in the middle, you tend to have the shortest persistence or correlation with your original wealth, because you could go either way. The middle class seems like the most fragile structure of the three.
Gotcha. And so do we have a sense at all of this, sometimes we heard about upward mobility, that, in America, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps and these types of things. Do we know anything about America versus other countries in terms of those who you were sharing at the bottom of that wealth being able to get out, to be able to have upward mobility?
Upward mobility is measured, for example, by the World Economic Forum, who published a study on it, in fact, in 2020. And the ratings of different countries in the world were based on, well, first of all, upward mobility is often defined by economists as the probability that within your lifetime, if you start in the bottom decile, you'll get to the top decile at some point. There are other ways, more involved ways of defining it, such as the World Economic Forum's definition. They tend to look at a number of things like access to healthcare, access to technology, working conditions, social protection, a number of different criteria that they look at. The United States comes in number 27th in the world, in spite of having the biggest economy in the world, in these terms, if in this quantification that they made. The first 5 countries in the world in terms of social mobility are, in fact, Scandinavian countries. I think Denmark is first, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland are all in the top. Most of the rest are in the top 10. I think all of the rest in the top 10 or 15 are European countries, with the exception of Canada, which comes at number 14. It's the first non-European country on the list. The UK is in the low 20s, the US is 27. And yeah.
So it's rough to hear for those of us who might want to go into a higher category there. Is there a sense, right, because we seem to pride ourselves emotionally or nationally on this sense that America is the place to do that. Many people come to America with that ideal. Could you either speak to kind of why it isn't, or is there is there one or two things that if we did or implemented in terms of economic policy, it would make it more possible, or we would rise in those rankings?
Well, there are a number of things. One general thing that I'd mention at the outset is macroeconomists have known for a long time that there is a strong correlation between upward mobility and inequality, in the sense that countries that have larger inequality tend to have smaller upward mobility. So it's a negative correlation between the two. In fact, you can make a scatter plot of countries, look at their upward mobility, look at their level of inequality, and the curve that you get that demonstrates this is called the Great Gatsby curve, which is kind of a nice name for it. So that's one point. I think one thing that we could do to increase upward mobility and really achieve what we call it the American dream is to decrease inequality. That would create, or at least it would correlate with a more level playing field for everybody. But there are other issues as well. You touched on the issue of race earlier when we were talking. And there is and this speaks to how long, for example, autocorrelation of wealth can persist. If autocorrelation of wealth at the very, very top is found to persist for 100 years, then this goes back to times of, post-slavery. It's difficult to quantify just how long the period of time is, but it locks in economic levels for generations in some cases. Now, this is not to say that nobody escapes from this, that nobody pulls out of it. It's just to say that on average, there is this long memory. There's a wonderful publication. I think this is available for many cities. The one that I've read, because I'm from the Boston area, is The Color of Wealth in Boston. And this was a joint project between the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and Duke University and the New School of Economics in New York City. And they looked at average wealths of household wealths of families in the Boston area, in Boston metropolitan area, the area roughly from which you could commute to Boston. And what they found was I think I'm remembering the numbers correctly, the average household wealth of a white household in that area was on the order of $250,000. The average household wealth of a Black family in that same area was so close to zero, you might say that it's zero. That doesn't mean that they live in poverty. It just means that when you take assets minus liabilities, right, they're just mortgaged up to the hilt.
Wow. Wow. Well, it is definitely a complex issue, but one that is very clear in terms of the importance of us understanding this wealth and this wealth disparity that does exist, and hopefully advocating for things that can help create more opportunity to traverse the scales. Certainly, I would love to be able to do that. So unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I always like to ask, because there always seems to be this connection between the arts and sciences. So I was just wondering, do you have an arts interest or even an arts practice that you do yourself?
Not really an arts practice. I do like fine woodworking, and I work on that to some extent when I'm able to, when I find the time. I think there's a lot of that said. There's a strong correlation between mathematics and the arts. In that mathematics is often described as the science of patterns. We look for patterns in numbers, we look for patterns in geometry, etc. And of course, patterns figure very heavily in the arts, in music, in fine art of all sorts. And I think there's, certainly if you look at members of my department at Tufts University, there are many who have a strong interest in music, who are very accomplished at playing musical instruments. all the way from piano to rock music to singing in choirs, etc. I don't think it's a coincidence somehow that people who are into patterns like this, there's a beauty in mathematics that mathematicians will talk about. And the word beauty is really used in the sense of a beautiful theorem or a beautiful idea, etc. And that same invocation of beauty, I think, exists in both subjects.
Oh, wow. That's, I think, very, very true. And I know not only for myself, but also for my sons, playing the violin and then them playing the violin definitely helped pave a road to be much better in math at school. So there was definitely, but of course, I mean, it just from the outset, it was just embedded. Math was embedded in my learning of the violin for sure. So, well, Bruce Boghosian, thank you for helping us gain knowledge through the lens of creativity here on Artful Science.
Thank you, Ryan, very much for having me.